On a Thursday afternoon in late October, a woman pulled into my bay driving a 7-year-old mid-size sedan with 112,000 miles on it. She was not panicking. She was resigned. She had already called 2 shops. One quoted her $2,800 for a transmission rebuild. The other told her she probably needed a full replacement and handed her a number north of $4,000. She sat down across from my desk, folded her hands, and asked me one question. "Is there any chance it's something small?" I told her yes, and I meant it. 45 minutes later, she drove out of my shop having spent less than the cost of a dinner for 2. The transmission shifted cleanly. The shudder was gone. The hesitation that had been getting worse for 3 months had disappeared. She called me the next morning just to confirm it had held overnight. It had. It still had. Today, I am going to show you exactly what saved her transmission, why it costs almost nothing, why most shops will never lead with it, and why understanding this one tiny component could protect you from one of the most expensive misdiagnoses in the automotive world. Because here is the truth no one tells you at the service counter. The majority of transmission complaints that walk through shop doors are not transmission failures. They are transmission fluid management failures. At the center of that system sits a component smaller than your thumb, costs less than a fast food meal, and gets overlooked almost every single time. I have been working on vehicles for over 2 decades. In that time, I have watched the transmission industry quietly become one of the most financially dangerous spaces a car owner can enter. Not because mechanics are dishonest, though some are. Not because transmissions are fragile, though modern ones are more sensitive than people realize. But because the diagnostic path most shops follow skips the simplest explanation on the way to the most expensive one. A shudder during light throttle acceleration, a hesitation between second and third, a clunk when the transmission engages from a stop. These symptoms sound terrifying. They feel like the beginning of the end. Every time they appear, the assumption is internal mechanical damage. But most of the time, they are not. Most of the time, they are a fluid problem. And most of the time, a fluid problem comes back to one part nobody checks, the transmission filter. Here is what I need you to understand before we go any further. A modern automatic transmission is not a simple mechanical device. It is a hydraulic computer. Every gear change, every torque converter lockup cycle, every pressure adjustment made by the valve body depends on fluid moving at the right pressure, at the right time, through the right passages. That fluid is the lifeblood of the system, and the filter is what keeps that lifeblood clean enough to do its job. Most drivers never think about transmission fluid at all. They know about oil changes, they know about tire rotations, but the transmission filter is invisible. It sits deep inside the pan. Mechanics often replace it only when they are already deep into a repair. It does not make noise when it fails. It does not trigger a warning light when it starts to restrict flow. It just quietly begins to choke the system. As it chokes, the transmission starts making decisions it was never designed to make with degraded hydraulic pressure. Shift quality drops. Clutch engagement becomes inconsistent. The torque converter clutch starts to slip during the exact speed range where it should be locking solid. Drivers feel it as a shudder, usually between 40 and 55 miles per hour, usually during light acceleration, usually when the engine is warm. It feels mechanical. It feels serious. It is not. That shudder has a name. It is called torque converter clutch shudder. It is one of the most commonly misdiagnosed symptoms in the entire transmission world. Shops that do not know better, or shops that do know better but are following a profitable diagnostic path, point at the torque converter itself. They point at solenoids. They point at internal clutch packs. They hand you a quote that starts at $1,500 and climbs fast. But before any of that is justified, one question must be answered. When was the transmission filter last replaced? And what does the fluid actually look like right now? Most of the time, nobody can answer that question. Most of the time, nobody has touched the transmission since the car left the factory. Let me tell you what happens inside that pan over time. From the moment the car leaves the assembly line, the transmission filter is doing its job. It catches metal particles shed during normal wear. It catches clutch material that releases during gear changes. It catches varnish and oxidation byproducts from heat-stressed fluid. For the first 30,000 to 50,000 miles in most vehicles, it handles this without complaint. But fluid degrades. Heat cycles break down the additives that keep friction materials behaving correctly. Oxidation builds up, particles accumulate. And the filter media, which was never designed to last the lifetime of the vehicle in most applications, begins to restrict flow. Once flow restriction begins, hydraulic pressure across the system drops. The valve body, a precision-machined block of channels and valves that directs fluid pressure to clutch packs and servos, starts receiving inconsistent input. Shift solenoids that rely on stable pressure to trigger gear changes start behaving erratically. Clutch apply pressure becomes uneven, and the torque converter clutch, which requires a specific pressure differential to lock and unlock cleanly, starts slipping. This is not a transmission failure. This is a maintenance failure masquerading as a transmission failure. And the fix is a filter that typically costs between $4 and $8, plus a drain and fill of fresh fluid suited to the application. That is the $5 part. A small, often paper or mesh element sitting at the bottom of the transmission pan, soaking in fluid it no longer cleans effectively, silently corrupting the hydraulic signals that every single gear change depends on. Now, here is the part that bothers me most about how this gets handled. The filter is not difficult to access on most vehicles. The transmission pan drops with basic tools. The old filter pulls out or unscrews in seconds. A new gasket goes on. Fresh fluid goes in. The whole job, done properly, takes an experienced technician less than an hour. On most common domestic and import vehicles, the parts cost is embarrassingly low. So why do so many drivers end up at the transmission rebuilder first? Two reasons. The first is diagnostic momentum. When a driver describes transmission shudder, the conversation almost immediately moves toward internal components. That is where the dramatic diagnoses live. That is where the scary words live. Clutch pack wear, torque converter failure, valve body malfunction. Those words feel serious because they sound serious. A filter change does not sound serious. It sounds like maintenance. And maintenance does not command the same urgency or the same invoice total. The second reason is service history blindness. Most shops, when presented with a transmission complaint, do not start by asking what has been done to the transmission. They start by scanning for codes. If codes exist, the codes become the story. If a solenoid code is present, the solenoid becomes the suspect. If the torque converter clutch code fires, the torque converter becomes the target. Nobody stops and asks whether a restricted filter could be causing the pressure drop that triggered the solenoid code in the first place. Because here is the uncomfortable truth about transmission codes. They tell you what the system detected. They do not tell you why the system detected it. A solenoid code does not mean the solenoid has failed. It can mean the solenoid received the wrong pressure because fluid could not move fast enough through a clogged filter to give it what it needed. Replace the solenoid without fixing the root cause, and the code often returns. Except now, you are $400 deeper and no closer to a solution. I have seen this cycle repeat more times than I can count. Solenoid replaced, shudder returns. Fluid changed without filter replacement, temporary improvement, shudder returns. Torque converter replaced, shudder returns. Why? Because a new torque converter still operates through the same restricted hydraulic circuit. New parts fed dirty pressure still fail like old parts. The filter is not the only culprit. The fluid itself matters enormously. Modern automatic transmissions use highly specific fluid formulations, and this is where a second category of misdiagnosis lives. If the wrong fluid type was introduced at any previous service, or if the correct fluid degraded beyond its service life, the friction modifiers responsible for smooth clutch engagement and clean torque converter lockup are no longer functional. The symptom is the same shudder, the same hesitation, the same rough engagement. But the solution is not a rebuild. It is a proper drain and fill with the correct OEM-specified fluid. Every major manufacturer publishes a specific fluid specification for their transmission. Toyota has WS, Honda has DW1, Ford has Mercon LV, GM has Dexron 6, Chrysler has ATF plus 4. These are not interchangeable. They are not suggestions. Using a generic multi-vehicle fluid in a transmission designed for a specific formulation will, over time, produce exactly the symptoms that look like internal damage. The clutch packs rely on the friction characteristics of the correct fluid. The torque converter clutch relies on the correct slip characteristics at lockup. Get the fluid wrong, and you get the symptoms wrong. This is why the full service matters. Not just the filter, not just the fluid. Both, done together, with the correct specification fluid, is the complete answer in a majority of cases that present as transmission complaints without mechanical cause. Here is how to know if your transmission is a candidate. If your vehicle has more than 60,000 miles and has never had the filter replaced and the fluid serviced, you are already overdue, regardless of symptoms. If you experience light throttle shudder between 40 and 55 miles per hour, that is one of the clearest indicators of torque converter clutch shudder caused by degraded fluid or restricted hydraulic pressure. If you notice hesitation between second and third gear, or a soft engagement when shifting from drive into reverse, hydraulic pressure is likely compromised. If the fluid on the dipstick or in the pan on sealed units is dark brown or black rather than red or light pink, oxidation has progressed beyond the point where a flush alone restores function. You need the pan dropped, the filter replaced, and fresh fluid installed. What you do not need in most of these scenarios, at least not until the filter service has been performed and evaluated, is a rebuild quote. The filter must be ruled out first, every time. One more thing I want to address, because I hear this objection constantly. Some manufacturers list their transmissions as sealed with lifetime fluid. Lifetime in this context does not mean what drivers assume it means. It means the lifetime of the warranty period, not the lifetime of the vehicle. Engineers know fluid degrades. The lifetime label is a cost reduction decision on the manufacturer's side, not a technical statement about fluid durability. Sealed transmissions still benefit from fluid changes. Many still have accessible pans if you know where to look. And every transmission built by a human organization will outlast its fluid if the fluid is maintained and fall short of its potential if the fluid is not. A woman who drove into my bay that Thursday was 3 weeks away from authorizing a transmission replacement she did not need. What stopped that from happening was a pan drop, a new filter, a new gasket, and the correct fluid for her specific application. The total cost with labor at my shop was under $120. The total quote she had received elsewhere was $4,200. That difference is not a 1 in a million exception. It is what happens when a filter gets replaced before a transmission gets condemned. Understand your fluid. Replace your filter on schedule. Demand that every shop rule out hydraulic restriction before they quote you internal repairs. Before you authorize anything more than a pan drop and filter service for transmission complaints, make sure someone has looked inside that pan and given you a real answer about what they found. Because that $5 filter is not a miracle. It is just what should have been maintained from the beginning. Knowing that it exists, knowing what it does, and knowing when to ask about it is the difference between a $120 repair and a $4,000 mistake. If this changed how you think about transmission problems, hit like so more drivers see it before they get the wrong quote. Subscribe if you want breakdowns like this every week, the kind that put knowledge in your hands before it costs you money. Drop a comment if a simple maintenance fix ever saved you from a repair bill that should never have been that high. Every one of those stories matters. The most expensive repair is always the one that replaces what maintenance would have prevented.